It's time for the Comic Bin Comic Book Podcast. The podcast you look forward to for all of your news and reviews of the best comic books hitting stands. Whether it's DC,
Batman, Wonder Woman,
Marvel,
Spider-Man,
Image,
Spawn, Saga,
Boom,
Once and Future, Power Rangers,
or whatever book or publisher you follow,
we cover them all here.
this is the place for you.
That's right, it's for everyone.
This is the Comic Bin Comic Book Podcast.
Let's get it.
Hello, folks. This is Theo, and I am back with another episode of the Comic Bin Comic Book Podcast. This week, I got 3 books that I'm going to be covering, my top 3 of the week, this past week. But why only 3 books? Well, that's because I got a special for you. I am going to play an interview that I just recently had with comic book writer Cullen Bunn. He and I sat down and we talked about, first of all, we talked about his history in writing horror. And more specifically, I got together with him to talk about Gatchaman and the series that's going on right now at Mad Cave Comics. We get into a conversation as to how he connected with the guys at Mad Cave to do this series and what's been going on through these first few issues. Unfortunately, I don't get him to spoil anything, but we had a good conversation just talking about the series, where it's at right now and where it's going, and as well as some of the things that's been going on in some of those other books that are within the Gatchaman universe. There was the recent Ken one-shot that came out, and then also there is the miniseries that Steve Orlando is doing that's focusing on Galactor, the villain group of the Gatchaman series. You know, I was very excited to sit down with him and talk about this. Again, knowing I am an oldie when it comes to comics, being a child of the 80s, I grew up watching Battle of the Planets on TV. Usually on Saturday mornings, but also on weekdays when it came on in the afternoon. So again, it was a good conversation. We talked for about a half hour, just talking about what he's doing with Gatchaman and how everything came together and what we can expect for the rest of this universe that he is putting together. I am happy he is keeping it as close to the original series as possible. But once again, after that, we'll get back and then I'll get into my top 3 books of this past week. But until then, here's my interview with comic book writer Cullen Bunn, and I will see you on the other side. Hey folks, it's Theo. I am sitting here with the master of horror, Cullen Bunn. Cullen, how are you doing? Welcome to the Comic Bin Comic Book Podcast. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you, Theo?
I am doing well. Before we started recording, we both started talking about how damn hot it is here in the South and the Midwest. So, you know, that is life for us these days.
For sure.
So if I can ask, before we get into our main topic of this interview, your big thing is in horror. What turned you on to writing horror? Was it a particular author like Stephen King or a particular director like Wes Craven, or was it a particular book or movie? What made you say, this is what I want to do?
You know, I think to some degree I was always into horror. I don't know that I necessarily branded it that way. I just liked all sorts of, speculative fiction. I like horror, I like science fiction, I like fantasy. I liked all of it. I was, as a really young kid, I was fascinated with, say, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the stories of the Headless Horseman was one of my first things I was really into. I was always trying to sneak out of my room late at night to watch the late horror show that my older brothers and sisters were watching. I was always fascinated with ghosts and, monsters and everything like that. So I was always interested in horror to some degree. I think things kind of shifted for me in high school. I had this big dream of being a special effects makeup artist for horror movies. And I started really getting into, like I was, reading Fangoria, and I was that blossomed into reading horror novels, and then it just sort of cemented more and more that I just that was my favorite genre, I guess. But I still like science fiction and fantasy. I guess I do gravitate to horror stories again and again, and it's just a mix of things that draws me back.
See, you and I were complete opposites coming up because when I was a little boy, again, I was like you, sneaking out to watch stuff. But I watched the original Night of the Living Dead, and I swear I couldn't sleep for like 3 days. And I swore I would never watch a horror movie again. And I probably didn't until I was a teenager watching, Friday the 13th and, Nightmare on Elm Street once that
Sure,
became a thing.
sure.
And it's okay now, but oh no, coming up, you couldn't get me. After I watched Night of the Living Dead, the original one, no, I was out. Nope. So why do you feel horror is so big in comics these days? You look at crowdsourcing and on Kickstarters, you see what James Tynion is doing. What you're doing? Why is horror so big right now in comic books?
Well, I guess all those creators who are doing horror books, I'm expecting the thank you cards anytime. Just that's a joke. That's a joke before anybody thinks I'm being serious. I think I I don't know. I think that the thing that draws people to horror in comics is you can tell so many different kinds of stories within the horror genre. So you can tell stories that are very uh that are just what you'd call like a balls to the walls horror story. It's a dark, grim, terrible, terrifying story. You can tell action horror. You can tell stories that are, comedic, horror stories with comedic elements, horror stories with science fiction elements. So I think there's so much potential in there that that you can tell any kind of story, and I think that there's an appeal there.
So, of all of your created titles, of your horror titles, which one gave you your biggest aha or whoa moment? You got to the finish of it and you started looking it over as a reader instead of the writer. And when you were done with it, you're like, whoa, I may want to take this in another direction now.
Well, it's some of my books that have been branded as horror books, for instance. uh, I don't necessarily see as horror titles. The Sixth Gun, for instance, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's a horror western," and I see it as a dark fantasy western. But that's okay. I mean, whichever way people want to view it, right? I don't care about that. Um, Sixth Gun was a big one because we were able to tell the story we wanted to tell. It was a long running story. I mean, it was more than 50 issues, and and at the end, I was like, we were very satisfied with what we'd done. We were able to look back at it and see where, see where we'd succeeded. We were proud of it. Same with my book Harrow County, which is a horror book. We ran 30 something issues, and we were very proud of the series as a whole. And I think that's both of those series. I look back, and I don't know if it's the aha moment you're asking about, but they both were sort of revelations for me in that those were stories that, without false modesty, we I'm very proud of. I don't think there's a bad issue in the bunch of either of those series. And and I think they represent, who I am as a creator, what we wanted to do. And they opened my eyes to what you can do in comics given the right, support system, and you know the room to let a book breathe and grow. There's a lot you can do.
So, Cullen Bunn, Master of Horror, how in the world did you and the guys at Mad Cave Studios connect on Gatchaman?
Right, because it is a little bit of a departure when we talk about a lot of these horror books. It seems it's a little bit of a surprise, I guess. I had been doing a couple of books for Mad Cave. I did a book called A Legacy of Violence, which is a slasher book. And I was doing a book called Hexiles, which is a upcoming creator-owned horror title that I did. Um, and while I was working on those, Mike Martz, who I had worked with at other publishers, uh, reached out to me and he just said, "Hey, have you ever heard of Gatchaman?" And that was all. I think that's all the email said was, like, "Have you ever heard of Gatchaman?" And I, of course, I had. I was a massive fan as a kid of Battle of the Planets, which is the Americanized version of Gatchaman. So, I mean, it was my favorite thing for, a year or so. And so I wrote back and I was like, "Oh yeah, I know Gatchaman very well. I'm a big fan. Ask me about the Fiery Phoenix. Ask me about, the different characters. I can tell you all about them." And he then we hopped on the phone and he revealed that Mad Cave had gotten the license for Gatchaman. They had big plans for the property, and they just wanted to know if I was interested in putting something together in that universe. And I immediately started putting together like a plan and an outline for what I would do in the world of Gatchaman.
So when looking at the series, and you kind of mentioned both, the original Science Ninja Team Gatchaman that came out of the 70s,
Mhm.
out of Japan, and Battle of the Planets, which was the Americanized version. Did you kind of took most of your inspiration from the American version? I'm taking from your previous comment.
Well, my initial inspiration was from the American version because that's what I was really familiar with. I'd maybe seen an episode, or two of the of Gatchaman itself, but Mad Cave also sent me every episode of Gatchaman, and I did a deep dive into watching Gatchaman. It's uh, I watched the whole series forward and back to pick up that. So maybe even the initial challenge, not so much anymore, was not leaning into the stuff from Battle of the Planets because it's not the same. There are a lot of similarities, right? But the story and the sort of the tone of the stories is different. So I did dig into the original Japanese series, and that's when things kind of felt. So I went back to my outline and said, okay, well, I got to change a few things that don't work anymore, and and massaged it from there. But then I wanted it to feel like the original Japanese series.
Cool. Yeah, and that's definitely how it happens, at least back then. I grew up again watching Battle of the Planets and Voltron and Robotech, and recently I started, for a feature I'm working on for the site, I started looking at the original Go Lion series, which is the
Sure.
original Voltron out of Japan, and it's
Right.
completely different
Yeah.
than what we saw as kids coming up.
Yeah,
When
you watch that original you watch that original Go Lion, and there's all this crazy mythology built into it that you never knew existed when you were a kid, right? When you were watching Voltron, which
at
nothing
all.
nothing against Voltron. I love Voltron. But that Go Lion has crazy storylines connected to it.
Yeah, and it's just it makes you wonder, how they're able to do it today, because today you don't see that. You go to Crunchyroll and whatever's out there is out there.
Right.
But I mean, us coming up as kids, when we were watching Voltron, we had no idea that the way they was moving their lips, they were saying something totally different than what we were hearing.
Right.
And
Right.
hearing it now is just astonishing to know how different they were.
Right.
And yeah, I plan on, getting through the entire season to compare the two. Um,
Right.
so in this most recent issue, or in issue 2, which is already out on shelves,
Mhm.
we had the Devil Stars make their appearance. We also see the first appearance, at least in your series, of Leader X.
Right.
How do you plot out when you want to make these debuts of these characters that are from the universe?
Well, it's to some degree, it's a little bit of reverse engineering, because I kind of sit back and I say, okay, I really want, I want, for instance, I wanted June in issue 3 to kind of be on a solo mission, right? I knew I wanted a solo mission with June, and I knew I wanted her to infiltrate the Devil Stars. Spoiler alert. But so I reverse engineer it from that. I'm like, when do I want that to happen? When does that, fit in? And then some of the other bigger characters, it's just a matter, when I outlined my series for Gatchaman, I outlined initially 5 big arcs. Like, these are the 5 big arcs, and in each of these arcs, these things have to happen. And so so you just have to seed in. I just have to figure out where you can seed those um, in the most relevant way. I couldn't put Leader X in the first issue really because I think it would have. I wanted the first issue to stand kind of in a way that people could, ease themselves into the world of Gatchaman, right? So I'm easing them into the characters in issue or into the lead characters. Issue 2, okay, now I'm going to introduce some, I'm going to seed in a few more elements. So it's just planning out how you seed these concepts into the story in a way that makes it palatable for the reader. Because you have to keep in mind, you and I might be familiar with Gatchaman, but I want this book to appeal to people who have never even heard of Gatchaman, and I want people to be able to not feel lost. So it's just planning it out, introducing these characters where they need to fit in the story, but also in the way that doesn't make it overwhelming to a new reader.
Yeah, definitely understand. And if you guys can still find it, you can also get a good bit of lead in if you find the free comic book day issue that
Yes.
kind of introduce these characters as well. Some comic shops still have them, so if you can find one, get one. Um, so how did you connect with your co-creator on this title, Chris Batista? Because let me tell you, when I read this and I see his line work and then I see the colors from Carlos Lopez, I really get the feel that I'm watching a Saturday morning cartoon.
You and me both.
How,
I
how,
mean,
how did you connect with those guys?
they were brought in by Mad Cave. So that was Mad Cave said, "Hey, Cullen, we're thinking Chris Batista for this book." And I was familiar with Chris's work enough to say, "Oh yeah, Chris, great. Let's go. Let's see how it looks." And then those first pages came in, and for me, a huge goal for me in this book is I wanted it to feel in the writing like the animated series. I don't, I understand, sometimes these, adaptations or tie-ins come out and the creative team wants to do something completely departed from the source material. And I think in some cases that's awesome, and in some cases that works really well. I knew that's not what the licensor necessarily wanted here, but it's not what I wanted. I wanted to tell a story that 1000% is set in the world of the cartoon, and I wanted it to feel like the cartoon. And then I saw Chris's work, and I was like, oh my! I was like, Chris gets it. Chris, Chris is
He really
yeah.
does. I was like, wow.
It his work. One of the joys of writing comics is that I get to see art come in based on the story I've written, and I see emails come in, and it's a constant joy, right, to see that stuff. Chris's is one of those where I was like, holy cow, this is I mean, it looks like a cartoon. And that's not, and it, in a great way. Um, and it's, there's so much action on the page. There's so much, uh, the pages are so dynamic. and there's so much movement on what are essentially, you forget that they're static images based on the way Chris draws it. And yeah, and you got to, I mean, let's not discount the coloring of the book. It's vibrant, it's bright, it's beautiful. It is. It's one of those situations like this is absolutely. If I could have envisioned it, like I could have willed it into existence, this is what I would have wanted it to be.
Yeah, especially again if you wanted to have that Saturday morning cartoon feel, you want those bright, vivid colors. And
Right.
that seems to be a thing that's coming back because folks at IDW are doing their Saturday morning cartoon series with
Right.
either Mutant Ninja Turtles or Dungeons. So it's a thing and it is beautiful. Like I said, when I picked up the free comic book day issue, and I was like, oh, this is going to be the series, I am so in.
Right.
It's just wonderful. Now, your series is part of a bigger universe. We've already had the Ken one shot that was
Yes.
done by Tommy Lee. And
Mhm.
then Steve Orlando is doing the Galactor miniseries that really focuses on Bert Kotze.
Yes.
How have you collaborated with those guys to say, okay, this is what I'm looking at? How can you fit it into what you're doing?
So we all have been on, several calls, several meetings to discuss, what the big plan was. So early on, there was a call with Tommy Lee and with Steve, and we all got in on a call, and I kind of ran down the outline for the Gatchaman series. I said, "This is what's going to happen." So they know everything that's going to happen. Big picture, they know everything that's going to happen in the first five arcs of Gatchaman, and then those two said, well, if these are the things you want to do, here's some of the things we love. Can we incorporate this? And some of the stories that they're telling are really kind of they're telling some real gonzo wild stories in the world of Gatchaman. And and so they looked at that outline and said, here are where we think we can, tell stories that are unique to us, unique stories for Gatchaman, and and are going to excite readers in different ways. And I really think it's fun because the stories play so well against each other and around the framework of that first of the main Gatchaman title.
Okay. So are you like me and in the world, the Battle of the Planets and Gatchaman, is Ken your favorite character? Or are you on the sinister side and you're looking more towards Leader X and Bert Day?
When I was a kid, my friend Doug and I, like I said, Battle of the Planets was our favorite thing, right? It was, we, that was when we went out and played games, we played Gatchaman and stuff. It was, and we had knocked down, drag out fights over who was cooler, Ken or Joe. At the time, it was Mark or Jason.
I
But yeah,
believe it
Ken
was
or Joe,
Jason.
which of the characters were the coolest? And I was always a Ken guy. I was always Ken is my favorite character. Or at the time Mark. The Eagle. I was always I was the biggest fan of the Eagle.
Right.
Um, these days I still have that sort of reverence for Ken, but my favorite character might be June. I think she's probably my favorite character in the bunch. Um, but also, yeah, of course I like the villains. I'm a villain guy. I like villains. I think villains deserve, a good villain can be a lot of fun, especially sort of a scene chewing villain like you get like you get in Gatchaman. So yeah, I like the villains. I love I love that the different commanders of the different Galactor initiatives all have different masks and sort of different personalities, and they're also weirdly over the top. And it's one of the reasons I like the stuff that Tommy Lee and Steve are doing with the Ken book and the Galactor miniseries because they dig into those villains in a big way. And
Yeah, yeah,
so I like the weirdness of Galactor a lot.
yeah. I definitely enjoyed what Steve did on the Galactor side because it looks like he's going to be pulling back a whole bunch of layers
Oh yes.
to
Yeah.
allow us to learn a lot about how Berghaus Steve came to be. So I'm really excited about that. But I'm also excited for issue number 3 because again, when you get to that last page of issue number 2 and you see June in that outfit getting ready to say, "Hey, I'll infiltrate the Devil Stars." I'm really excited to see her on her own. Could we expect to see more solo issues of other folks like Ryu? Could we expect more of that in the series?
Yeah, you'll definitely be able to see. There's definitely books planned that are, you know, sort of solo adventures for some of the characters, and but also team stories, team dynamics that are told from the perspective of some of the other characters, more that are more focused on the other characters. I just turned in one of the craziest issues of my series, and it's a very Jinpei. It's the entire team together, but it's a very Jinpei focused story.
Will it be, well, I mean, considering Jinpei is our youngest member, will it be like a coming of age? If you, no, without
I
spoiling, of
I
course.
can't spoil this story.
Okay.
I'll tell you. It's sort of a, within the arcs, it's sort of a story that stands on its own. It is a bizarre issue in a good way, I hope, but it's going to be a lot of fun. Um, it is definitely the weirdest of the issues I've written so far.
I am excited. Again, when I see these series, that brings me back to when I first got into cartoons and comics as a kid. I always jump at it. And again, reading this series really brought me back because it had the look and the feel of everything that was Battle of the Planet. So I truly, truly appreciate that.
Well,
But
I'm happy to hear that.
how, and I ask this usually of everyone that I interview, you got me sold. I'm in. It's on my pull list.
Mhm.
How would you sell this title to someone that's sitting on the fence? They see this cover, which again, let me talk a little bit about the covers if I can also. Those covers are beautiful. I don't I struggle trying to decide which one am I gonna get. If I am I gonna stick with cover A or if I'm gonna get me a variant. But how would you sell someone who's on the fence on picking up Gatchaman?
Well, Gatchaman, this is sort of you're getting in on the ground floor of a story of a group of teenage superheroes, a young group of superheroes who are ninja with special techniques, but also super science backup, and they're dealing with their primary villain is a fringe science terrorist group. Uh, and like I said, you're getting in on the ground floor. You can jump in and enjoy these stories right away. They're action, they're fun, they're dynamic. But I think this is a story if you like stories with action, this is for you. If you like Power Rangers, for instance, this is. I don't think it's really that arguable that this is what inspired an entire almost Gatchaman really kind of informed an entire genre of storytelling after it was created. So yeah, if you're into mecha, this is it. If you're into giant monsters, this is it. If you're into ninjas, if you're into superheroes, it's got a little bit of something for everybody.
Yes, and you can always be like me who used to practice at drawing Gotcha Man, and that quickly made me realize that I was not meant to be an artist. But the title is Gotcha Man. The writer is Cullen Bunn with art from Chris Batista. Cullen, how can fans keep up with what you're doing today?
So the best way, you can always visit my newsletter or my website is cullenbun.com. From there, you can subscribe to my newsletter. I put it out pretty much weekly, and it will keep you informed on all the things I'm working on in sort of my views on the writing life and just all sorts of nonsense. It comes out weekly, but you can get that from my website is cullenbunn.com.
And I will have links in the show notes. So if fans want to follow Cullen and keep up with what's going on in his world of horror, you can follow along or follow along with what's going on in Gatchaman. Cullen Bunn, thank you so much for joining me here on the Comic Bin Comic Book Podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So again, I want to thank Cullen Bunn for taking a moment to sit with me to talk about Gatchaman. Again, issue number 2 is out on the shelves already. Came out at the end of July. Issue number 3 is currently scheduled to come out on the 11th of September. So if it's not on your pull list, contact your comic book shop and ask them to put it on there. Again, if you are a fan of the anime, you will really enjoy this series. He does a good job of keeping this story as close to the anime universe as possible, and I've really been enjoying it as someone who used to watch this as a little boy. So again, thanks to the folks at Mad Cave Studios for connecting Cullen Bunn and I so that we can have this conversation, and hopefully we can get back together and talk a little bit more after this current arc is up and we move in a little bit further along in this universe that he's creating with Gatchaman. Again, and don't forget that there are the one-shots that are out there, the Kin one-shot, as well as the Galactor miniseries that's coming from Steve Orlando. Now, there's also another one-shot that Tommy Lee Edwards is going to be doing that's going to focus on June, aka The Swan, that is coming out soon as well, so be on the lookout for that. But again, thanks to Cullen Bunn and the folks at Mad Cave, and again, if you're not reading Gatchaman, strongly suggest that you pick it up and give it a read. It's a really fun series thus far. So before closing out, I am going to give an abbreviated rundown of my top 3 books of the past week instead of top 5, of course. But to kick things off, Batman Superman World's Finest number 30, written by Mark Waid with art by Gleb Melanchoff over at DC Comics. So if you guys are following this series, and we remember earlier in the run, there was an arc that focused on Bruce and Clark meeting and teaming up for the first time. And this story is in issue 30 is somewhat like that, but it's a one-issue story. It's a one-off, and it focuses on the very first time that Clark and Bruce teamed up with Wonder Woman, and so it involves a murder mystery that occurred on Themyscira, and Diana invited them to the island. And remember, that's the only way that man can step foot on Themyscira, is if they are invited. But she invites them to the island so that they can help her solve this mystery. But in the end, what we come to find out, Bruce being the world's greatest detective and all, is that the murder that supposedly occurred never occurred, and it was all a distraction for this godlike figure, Dolos, the Duke of Deception, to escape and to capture the flame of Hermes. And so through all of that distraction, he was able to do so. And the story goes into how Clark, Bruce, and Diana basically fought back so that it allowed them to push Delos back into the prison and that held him. But it was a good story. Again, it's a one-off that I'm assuming was done to basically hold things over while absolute power is going on. And again, World's Finest is from the early days of Batman and Superman teaming up. But again, just a one-off story, but it was an enjoyable story. From an art standpoint, again, Gleb Melanchoff is a good artist, but of course he's not Dan Mora. but I've been a fan of his since his Robin run with Joshua Williamson a few years ago. And with the colors that are done by Tamara Bonvillain, who's been with Dan Moore from the start. As a matter of fact, that partnership goes back, as far as I can remember, to Once and Future, the series that he did with Karen Gillan over at Boom. With the colors that Tamara Bonvillain does, you can tell the art is different, but it's not that far off, considering the colors that are on top of the pencils and inks. So it's a good story. I truly enjoyed it. It's a step down from the most recent arc, which focused on the imps of the fifth dimension. I really enjoyed that one. That was fun. But again, it was just a good, fun story to hold things over. I'm assuming again until Absolute Power is over. But again, that is Batman Superman, World's Finest, number 30, from Mark Waid and Gleb Melankoff over at DC Comics. In the number 2 spot, a title that would usually be in the number 1 spot when it is released, but that is Ultimate Spider-Man number 8 over at Marvel Comics, written by Jonathan Hickman with art from Marco Cicchetto. This story, there's not much going on. There is somewhat of an interaction between Tony and Peter and Harry. And if you can remember, in issue number 7, Tony makes his way to Peter and Harry, seeing that Peter's been in the suit for a while, and so he's now made himself known to Peter. And in doing so, he makes it clear that he knows everything about the technology that Harry's using, because it's his, or at least it's his family. And so there's that interaction, and it was just fun seeing that one point where Harry didn't want to reveal who he was, and Tony just basically touched the suit, and bloop, there's Harry's face, which is kind of similar to what Harry did when he and Peter met for the first time, and he was able to take control of Peter's suit to reveal who his identity was. And of course, Peter got a laugh at that. The most important part of this story, and again, there's not much from an adventure standpoint going on. They're celebrating the kids' birthdays. There's interactions, between Uncle Ben and Jonah. It's just party stuff with the kids. But the most important part of this story happens at the end, when we get the introduction of the Ultimate Universe's Sinister Six. So we see Winston, Kingpin, of course. He goes and he brings in those members of the factions of the city that he controls, and he basically hands it off. And so we see some familiar faces as members of this Sinister Six of the Ultimate Universe, including Black Cat, Walter Hardy. In addition to Black Cat, there's also Mole Man, there's also Craven. So we see some familiar faces that are a part of this Sinister Six of the Ultimate Universe. So that is the most important piece of this story, and setting up the next arc that seems to show that Winston is going to put this game together to try to take down both Harry and Peter as they try to wrestle control of New York City from the Kingpin. But again, it's a good story. It's the same creative team with Jonathan Hickman and Marco Cicchetto. So, there's not much to add with regards to how much I enjoy the art and, how much it complements the story or the words that Jonathan Hickman is telling. But again, that is Ultimate Spider-Man number 8 from Jonathan Hickman and Marco Cicchetto over at Marvel Comics. Okay, so the title in the top spot, my number 1 book of titles released this past week. You all may want to mark this point in history down because I don't know if it'll ever happen again. But my number 1 book of the week, Wonder Woman number 12, written by Tom King with art from Tony Daniel. And this issue is not my favorite book for the week because of the backup story featuring Trinity and John and Damian. This issue is my top book because of the main story, which is an absolute power tie-in. And you know how I feel about tie-ins. But, I am, as much as you all know me to have been sour on Tom King since Batman 50 and Heroes in Crisis and all of that stuff that happened within Rebirth, I am going to give credit where credit is due. He has been doing a hell of a job on his run of Wonder Woman, and I've really been enjoying it. But with this tie-in issue, I did not know that I needed this as much as I did. So if you are following Absolute Power, in Absolute Power number 2, Diana was tasked with finding the location of the prison that Amanda Waller was housing all of the depowered superheroes so that she can go in and rescue them. And she was teamed up with Damian Wayne, aka Robin, to find this prison. Let me just say, I did not know I needed this team up as much as I did. This team up, and again, I can go back, the last team up of sorts that I remember was the team up that Damian did with Selena, which wasn't really much of a team up, but it was in the prelude to the wedding series where they did the one shot where Damian was hanging out with Selena, which was really good. This story outdoes it easily. I did not know that I needed this story with this duo as much as I did. And it is a story of complete opposites trying to get to the same conclusion. So again, they're trying to find out the location of this prison, and they figured that the person they need to go to is someone who is familiar with Amanda Waller, and that would be Captain Boomerang. And so Diana and Damian take turns with their own tactics to try to break Boomerang into giving out the location of this prison. For Damian's tactics is to use fear. He's going to basically put the fear of God into Captain Boomerang, and doing so would get him to reveal the location of this prison. And the bet was that if it didn't work, then Diana would try her own tactics, and her tactics would be using love. And using love would get Boomerang to just, and that would allow him to reveal the location of the prison. And neither worked. They go back and forth trying different things. Damian primarily, he hangs Boomerang from different locations in different scenarios, whether he's being dragged across the water by the invisible jet, or he's being dangled over water again with sharks below him. He tries everything, nothing works. Diana does the same thing. She tries different tactics as far as feeding him and giving him what he wants and just being the nicest person in the world, and reconnecting him with his son who was kind of abandoned, just all the stuff, and nothing works. I mean, it's just Boomerang just responds by just cussing him to high heaven. You're saying that it's not going to work. He's not going to reveal the location of this prison. And you see Damien and Diana going back and forth with these different tactics. And it gets to a point to where even Diana cracks and she beats the hell out of Boomerang. But again, none of it works. But in the end, and throughout the issue, as Diana is trying her various tactics to get Boomerang to crack, Damien constantly used the same phrase regarding Boomerang and he being the perfect person to crack the finest location, which is never underestimate the stupidity of a flash rogue. And it ends up being so true. But the funnest part of this story is not the interaction between Diana and Damien. It is the interaction between Boomerang and his son. So if you are a fan of The Flash and you followed that history, you know that his son Owen eventually took up the name Captain Boomerang Jr. and basically went on the same type of criminal spree that his dad did. And he was arrested, prisoned. Well, Diana works some magic to get him out of jail, and she reunites father and son. And it starts out as a wonderful reunion until Owen and his dad just start going back and forth about how one or the other messed up. And while Damien and Diana are having their own conversation, these two just start going at it. And that fight between those two and how Diana had to get involved to break it up was just absolutely hilarious. Again, this was a story I did not know that I needed. But again, as I mentioned earlier, no matter what Damien and Diana tried, going back and forth with the fear versus the love, nothing worked in getting Captain Boomerang to break and reveal the location of this prison. And just as they were about to give up and try something new, what Damien had been saying for the entire issue turned out to be true, because Boomerang, he sensed that they were giving up, and he just starts to gloat. And in his egotistical way of gloating, he reveals the location of the prison on Gamora Island, which proved Damien's original point, to never underestimate the stupidity of a Flash rogue. And for all that they tried, all they had to do was let Boomerang be Boomerang, and they were going to learn the location. So now they know the location of the prison on Gamora Island. And even as the issue ended, he was unaware of the fact that he blabbered out the location. So again, I did not know I needed this story and this team up. And if Tom King was to do more team ups with Damian and Diana, DC could have all of my money. This was a very fun story, and the I won't call it a relationship, but the interaction between Damian and Diana was simply perfect, because again, just who they are, polar opposites. Diana coming from a place of love, Damian coming from a place of fear, being the son of Batman, being the son of Talia al Ghul. They just, the polar opposites, just the interaction was just perfect. It was just straight odd couple hilariousness. And again, that's before even getting to the backup, is the Trinity story, which includes Damian and John. And, in this story, it's the older version now. They're all grown. I would assume Lizzie is maybe 16, 17, or 18. So, she's older, but still rather young. And John convinced them that they have to go and stop this new mongrel who is now gaining power and could eventually gain power, so much that he could destroy not just their universe, but the multiverse. And so they set out to get to where Mongrel is. And unfortunately, even the fastest ship that they're able to find, it would take them 72 days to get to where Mongrel is. And so the backup story is just basically an interaction between those three as these 72 days go on. And it's just hilarious because day 72, they make it to this planet where Mongrel is, and they're ready to do battle. And the battle is just one punch, and he's out. And they're like, that's it? You serious? Okay, well, I guess it's time to go home. And they realize that, wait a minute, because we're going against the wind and going home, instead of it taking 72 days, it's going to take 94 days. And they don't want to go 94 days of interacting with each other, whether it's the boys leaving the toilet seat up or Damien not, washing his clothes and being funky. It was just totally hilarious. And so because of that, they say, well, let's just wake him up and allow him to get a little bit more strength and battle before we have to worry about going home. And that was just a hilarious interaction. I have always loved the backup stories in Wonder Woman between Lizzie and Damian and John. They've been perfect and hilariously funny, and I've loved every bit of them. But again, this time around, the backup story isn't the reason why this issue is my top book. It was the main story. I really enjoyed the interaction between Damian and Diana. And from an artistic standpoint, I've always been a fan of Tony Daniel. I almost would have preferred if this issue was done by Daniel St. Pierre, but it wasn't. He did the cover, of course. But again, the art styles are different, but it didn't take away from how good the story was. It complemented things really well. And of course, Belena Ortega did the art in the backup story, as she's always done, which is really, really good. But again, this is my top book of the week, and yes, I am proud to say it. My top book of the week, Wonder Woman number 12, from Tom King, Tony S. Daniel, and Belen Ortega, over at DC Comics. So I know I said that I wasn't gonna do any honorable mentions because of the interview, but I'm gonna just go ahead and quickly mention three. There were some titles. It was a really good week for DC titles for me for some reason. I've as of late have been on a independent train of sorts. And you've seen that with some of the past few episodes, but this past week was a really good week for DC titles. But just real quick, honorable mentions. First up, from DC Comics, Superman number 17, from Joshua Williamson and Jamal Campbell. That was, again, another absolute power tie-in with Superman and Zatanna, and it ends up with them meeting Neron and at the Oblivion Bar. We're going to see how that turns out. But again, it almost made it into the top three had it not been for Ultimate Spider-Man kicking it out. But number 2 in my honorable mention list, Witchblade number 2, from Marguerite Bennett and Giuseppe Cafaro over at Image Top Cow. We see there that Sarah is still learning to gel with the Witchblade, and it's causing some issues. And not without spoiling it, it really causes some issues by the time you get to the end of the issue. And then my third honorable mention, Thundercats number 7, written by Declan Shelby, with art from Drew Moss over at Dynamite Entertainment. I am really starting to enjoy this series. It started out really slow for me, and it really started to pick up. At first, I thought I might have been enjoying the Chitara spinoff more, but things are really starting to pick up. We're seeing more and more of the mutants. They are starting to interact more, and I am really enjoying what they're doing now with this series. But that is my third and final honorable mention for titles that came out this past week. So yeah, it was a really good week. I had a bunch of books that I did read, but just thinking about, I didn't want to have a show that was too long, considering the interview with Cullen Bunn. So that is going to do it for this week's titles. Next week, let's see what is coming out on this coming Wednesday, August 28th. First up, these are the titles that I'm going to be reading. First up, Detective Comics number 1088 from writer Ram V with art from Gillian March. I am reading this only because it is finally coming to an end. This is the penultimate issue of Ram V's run. If you are following me over on the Batman Universe Comic Podcast, you know that I have not been a fan of this run of Detective, but I've been reading it all this time, and I am going to finish it out. So that is out on this coming Wednesday. Also, I will be reading Saga number 68 from writer Brian K. Vaughan and art from Fiona Staples. Then I will be reading Void Rivals number 12 from Robert Kirkman with art from Lorenzo De Felici over at Skybound Image. I'll also be reading Zatanna, Bring Down the House number 3 from Mariko Tamaki with art from Javier Rodriguez over at DC. Also at DC, I'm going to be reading Power Girl number 12 from Leah Williams with art from Travis Moore. It is the aftermath of Date Night with Axel and Paige. So we'll see how those things turn out. Then staying with Leah Williams over at DC Comics, it's going to be Gotham City Sirens number 4 with art from Ted Brandt and Danielle Hilliard and Rose Stein as they bring that series to an end. It has not been a great one. I've enjoyed the art. They've been bringing in different artists for each issue, and we're going to see the team of Brandt and Stein. I really wish they get with Chris Sabella and bring back Crowded, and that story was awesome. But they're going to be finishing out this weekly series that they've been doing for the month of August with the Sirens teaming up again. It's not been all of that fun as they've been battling Punchline. Then moving on to Marvel, we have Phases of the Moon Knight number 1 from Erica Schultz with art from Manuel Garcia. And also at Marvel, they have an anthology series that's going to be coming out celebrating Marvel's 85th anniversary. That's going to be the Marvel 85th anniversary special number 1. Don't know why they calling it a number 1 when it's only going to be that one issue. But again, I guess that's just the trend they and DC are doing. But they're going to have a bunch of writers with Christopher Priest and Alan Davis and Steve Scorsese with a bunch of artists. It's one of those anthology series that they always do from time to time. So that's coming out. Going back over by Image, we're going to do Gromits number 4, written by Rick Remenda and Brian Posehn, with art from Moreno Dionisio and Brett Parsons. Going over to Mad Cave, I'm going to be reading Flash Gordon number 2, written by Jeremy Adams, with art from Will Conrad. The first issue was really weird in the Flash Gordon type of way, but it was also really good. And we'll see what's going on for the second issue. Then we're going to move over, and I'll be reading over at IDW Publishing, Star Trek Defiant number 18 from writer Christopher Cantwell and art from Angel Unzueto. I just do not understand how I can enjoy Defiant so much and absolutely hate the main Star Trek story. That issue came out last week, and it's just not good at all. But Defiant has really been good. It is, for me, the best of the Star Trek titles, other than when they put out a Strange New Worlds miniseries. But I'll be reading that next week for this as well. Going back at least at Image, we have a new series, Convert number 1, written by John Arcudi, with art from Savannah Finley. Again, that's a new series. And then finally, over at Massive Publishing, I Lie Popeye number 1, written and drawn by Marcus Williams. I am so happy for him. I've known Marcus for a while. You know, I met those guys back years ago at Dragon Con when they were promoting, when he was promoting Tuskegee Airs with Greg Burnham. And I have been a fan of his style of art for years. Again, ever since I first met him at Dragon Con. And he most recently did the art on one of the stories in a recent issue of Edge of the Spider-Verse, which focused on Spider-Woman. and it was really good in that style of art that Marcus does. But he did this story with Popeye for Massive that I'm happy to see in the mainstream. I've read the first issue already. Really, really good. And I hope to see Marcus soon and talk to him about it. But it was really good work. And I've always been a fan of his art, but he really does a good job in writing this story as well. So I'm happy for him. But issue number 1 is going to be on shelves. Again, with this partnership that he's doing with Massive Publishing. And I'm happy for him for that. But again, we have another good week of comics coming out. I'll be busy reading them for those that I haven't read already. But as always, it's just a fun time to be a fan of comic books today. And I'm happy to be here for it. That is going to do it for this episode of the Comic Bin Comic Book Podcast. I'd like to thank you all for your continued support of the program. The Comic Bin Podcast, as well as the Comic Book Spot, are a part of the Comic Book Source family of sites and media. You can follow the podcast on Twitter X at comic_bin, or my personal account at BatmanFan_4life. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Threads. We're all over social media. You can also follow our sister site over at thebatmanuniverse.net for all of your news and reviews in the world of Batman. Tune in next time as we give you more in the world of comic books. Again, we truly appreciate your support. But until we meet again next time, keep reading those comics.